Welcome back to Eternal Flame Wisdom, my friends. I am so glad you are here with me today, because what I want to share with you is something that took me almost an entire lifetime to understand. It is not a happy lesson. It is not something anyone wants to hear when their children are still small and their arms are still full. But it is one of the most important truths a parent will ever learn, and most of us learn it far, far too late. When my children were young, I believed that being a good parent meant holding on. I believed my job was to protect them from every danger, guide every decision, soften every fall, and stay close enough that nothing could ever hurt them without hurting me first. I gave everything I had. I gave my time, my sleep, my dreams, my youth. And I did it gladly, because I loved them more than I loved my own life. But here is the lesson, my friends. Here is the hardest lesson parents learn too late. Love was never supposed to be about holding on forever. Love was supposed to prepare them to let go of us, and prepare us to let go of them. And nobody tells you that the very love that makes you a good parent in the beginning is the same love that must transform, again and again, into something that looks less like holding and more like releasing. I did not understand this while I was living it. I understood it only when I looked around one day and realized the house was quiet, the bedrooms were empty, and the children I had poured my whole heart into now had their own homes, their own lives, their own children. I sat there wondering where all the years had gone, and whether I had spent them the right way. I looked at the small marks on the doorframe where I once measured their height every birthday, and I wondered when exactly I had stopped noticing that they had already grown past my shoulder. So today, I want to walk you through 25 smaller lessons that live inside this one hard truth. Some of them will comfort you. Some of them may sting a little, especially if your children are still young. But I promise you, if you take even a few of these to heart now, you will not have to learn them the way I did, sitting alone in a quiet house, wishing I had known sooner. You do not need to accept every single one. Take what speaks to you, and leave the rest. Every family's road looks a little different, shaped by circumstances only you understand. But the destination, my friends, is almost always the same, and it comes for every parent whether we are ready for it or not. The first lesson I learned too late was that my children were never truly mine to keep. I loved my children so deeply that I began to think of them as extensions of myself, as if their choices were my choices, their successes were my successes, and their pain was my pain to fix. But children are not possessions. They are not even truly ours. They arrive through us, but they were always meant to walk their own road. I spent years trying to shape my children into the people I imagined they should become, instead of simply loving the people they already were. I remember sitting across from my oldest years later, hearing them describe a career path I never would have chosen for them, and feeling my chest tighten with an old, familiar fear. It was only much later that I understood. The moment I stopped trying to own their journey was the moment I finally became free to enjoy it, and the moment they finally felt free enough to invite me into it. There is a strange kind of grief in realizing your child was never a smaller version of you to complete, but a whole separate soul you were simply given the honor of raising. The second lesson was that protecting them from every pain was actually a kind of harm. I wanted so badly to shield my children from disappointment, failure, heartbreak, and struggle. Every time I saw them stumble, I rushed in to catch them before they hit the ground. But children who never fall never learn how to stand back up. By trying to remove every obstacle from their path, I was quietly stealing something precious from them, the confidence that comes only from surviving hardship on their own. I think often of the year my son lost a competition he had trained for tirelessly, and how badly I wanted to call the organizers, to intervene, to fix it somehow. I did not. And watching him rebuild his own resolve afterward taught him something no rescue of mine ever could have. Struggle is not the enemy of a good childhood. Struggle, in the right amount, is what builds the strength they will need for the rest of their lives, long after we are no longer there to soften every blow. The third lesson I learned too late was that my love needed to change shape as they grew. When they were babies, my love looked like holding them close every hour of the day. But that same kind of love, unchanged, becomes suffocating for a teenager and unbearable for a grown adult. I did not realize for many years that love has seasons. In one season, it means being everywhere. In another season, the most loving thing you can do is step back and simply be available, present but no longer hovering. I clung too tightly to the season of holding, long after my children needed the season of releasing, and it created a distance between us that took years to repair. I remember my daughter, at 16, closing her bedroom door a little harder than usual, and how long it took me to understand that the door was not a rejection of me, but a request for room to breathe. I mistook her growth for rejection, when really it was simply her becoming herself. The fourth lesson was that my worry was never actually protecting them. I used to believe that if I worried enough about my children, somehow that worry was a form of love, almost like a shield around them. But worry never protected anyone. It only exhausted me, and it slowly taught my children to feel like a burden rather than a joy. There is a difference between genuine concern that leads to loving action and endless anxious worry that leads nowhere but into your own chest at 3 in the morning. I remember pacing the kitchen floor the first night my daughter drove alone, convinced something terrible was happening simply because she was 5 minutes late. She walked in laughing, having stopped for gas, completely unaware of the storm inside me. I wish someone had told me sooner that peace is a better gift to give your children than constant fear, because a child raised on my fear eventually learns to fear the world instead of trusting it. The 5th lesson I learned too late was that my children could feel it when I was disappointed in who they were, rather than what they did. There is a very important difference between saying, "I am not happy with this choice," and making a child feel, "I am not happy with who you are." I did not always know how to separate the two. In moments of frustration, my words carried more judgment of their character than correction of their behavior, and children remember that distinction long after we have forgotten our own words. I still remember the sting on my own son's face after a careless comment I made about his grades, a comment I forgot within the week, but one he carried quietly for years, tucked away somewhere he thought I would never see. It took me years to learn how to criticize an action without ever letting my child doubt that they were fully, unconditionally loved underneath it, no matter what they had done or failed to do. The 6th lesson was that I could not pour from an empty cup, no matter how much I wanted to. I believed for a long time that a good parent gives until there is nothing left. I skipped my own rest, ignored my own needs, and told myself this was simply what love required. But children absorb far more from how their parents live than from what their parents say. A tired, depleted parent teaches exhaustion as normal, even while insisting they're fine. When I finally allowed myself to rest, to have interests outside of parenting, to be a whole person and not only a mother or a father, I became calmer, warmer, and far more present. My children noticed the change before I ever explained it to them, and they began, quietly, to imitate it in their own lives. I only wish I had learned this when they were small, instead of after years of quiet exhaustion I mistook for devotion. The 7th lesson I learned too late was that comparison was quietly poisoning our relationship. I compared my children to their siblings, to the neighbor's children, to the version of a perfect child that existed only in my imagination. I told myself this was motivation, that measuring them against others would push them to do better. But comparison never built anyone up. It only taught my children to see themselves through my disappointment instead of my belief in them. I remember the quiet way my youngest stopped mentioning his report card altogether, simply to avoid another comparison to his older sister, until eventually he stopped mentioning much of anything at all. Every child carries their own timeline, their own gifts, their own struggles. The moment I stopped comparing was the moment I finally began to see my children clearly, as individuals rather than as reflections of someone else's success. The 8th lesson was that my presence mattered far more than my provision. I worked long hours believing that if I gave my children a comfortable life, a good home, opportunities one never had, that this alone would prove my love. And providing for a family is important. My friends, I do not dismiss that. But what my children remember most now, as adults, are not the things I bought them. They remember the nights I sat on the edge of their bed and listened. They remember the mornings we made breakfast together, burning the toast more often than not, laughing about it anyway. They remember when I simply showed up, even to the smallest, least important events of their childhood, the ones I almost skipped because I was too tired or too busy. Presence leaves a deeper mark than provision ever can, and I wish I had understood that balance far sooner. The 9th lesson I learned too late was that my children needed to see me fail, apologize, and try again. For years, I tried to appear strong and certain in front of my children, as if a parent must never show weakness. But children do not learn resilience from a parent who never struggles. They learn it from watching a parent struggle and recover. Hiding my own mistakes did not make me look wiser. It only taught my children to hide their own mistakes from me, out of fear of falling short of an impossible standard. When I finally allowed myself to say, "I was wrong, I am sorry, let me try again," something shifted in our relationship. My children stopped seeing me as an untouchable authority and started seeing me as a real human being they could trust with their own mistakes, and eventually, with their own fears, doubts, and failures too. The 10th lesson was that discipline without connection breeds distance, not respect. I once believed that strict rules alone would raise good children. I focused heavily on consequences, structure, and correction, but I did not always pair that structure with warmth and connection. Over time, I noticed my children obeyed me, but they did not always come to me. They followed my rules but stopped sharing their hearts, and I mistook their silence for good behavior. It took a particularly painful year, when my teenage daughter stopped telling me almost anything about her life, for me to recognize what I had built: obedience without trust. It was only when I began balancing firm boundaries with deep emotional connection that my children began opening up again, not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted that I was still, above all, safe to talk to. The 11th lesson I learned too late was that every stage of childhood ends far sooner than you expect. When you are living inside the exhausting years of diapers, tantrums, homework, and endless questions, it feels as if that season will never end. But one day it simply does, quietly, without warning, and you do not get to relive it. I remember wishing away certain difficult days, silently hoping the hard phase would pass faster, counting down towards some easier future. And it did pass. All of it passed, far too quickly. I still remember the exact moment I realized I would never again carry my son to bed asleep in my arms, because he had simply grown too tall, too heavy, too old for that particular kind of closeness, and I had not marked the last time it happened as anything special. I did not understand until much later that even the difficult days were part of something I would give anything to have back. The 12th lesson was that listening mattered more than advice. For most of my parenting life, I believed my role was to guide, correct, and instruct. Whenever my children came to me with a problem, I immediately offered solutions. But eventually I realized that many times, they were not asking me to fix anything. They simply wanted to be heard, without judgment attached to every sentence they spoke. Constantly jumping in with advice, even well-meaning advice, sometimes taught my children to stop sharing altogether, because they felt judged rather than understood. I remember the evening my daughter finally told me, gently but honestly, that she did not need me to solve her problem, only to sit with her in it. Learning to simply listen, without immediately trying to solve everything, deepened our relationship in a way that years of good advice never could. The 13th lesson I learned too late was that my own childhood wounds were quietly shaping my parenting. I did not realize how much of my own upbringing, the parts that hurt me, the expectations placed on me, the emotions I was never allowed to express, were being passed down to my own children without my awareness. I repeated patterns I swore I would never repeat, simply because I had never healed the original wound, and unhealed wounds have a way of finding new hands to pass through. I heard my own father's harsh tone come out of my mouth one afternoon, aimed at my son over something trivial, and I stood there stunned by how familiar and how unwanted it sounded. It took deep, honest reflection to recognize that some of my reactions toward my children had very little to do with them, and everything to do with a hurt child still living inside me, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. The 14th lesson was that my children needed permission to be different from me. I quietly hoped my children would share my interests, my values, my view of the world, even my career path. When they did not, I sometimes felt a small sting of rejection, as though their differences were a judgment of me. But children are not meant to be copies of their parents. They are meant to take what serves them from what we gave them, and build something entirely their own on top of it. I think of my daughter choosing an entirely different life from the one I had imagined for her, and how long it took me to see her choice as bravery rather than distance from everything I valued. The day I fully accepted that my children's differences were not a rejection of me, but simply evidence of their own unique souls, was the day our relationship became far more peaceful and far more honest. The 15th lesson I learned too late was that fear-based motivation always has a cost. I sometimes used fear to guide my children's behavior, warning them of consequences, painting worst-case outcomes, hoping fear would keep them safe and disciplined. And in the short term, it often worked. But fear-based motivation comes at a price. It teaches children to make decisions from anxiety rather than confidence, and eventually, it teaches them to hide things from you rather than come to you when it matters most. I remember discovering, years later, how many small struggles my son had quietly carried alone as a teenager simply because he feared my reaction more than he trusted my support. Struggles I never even knew he was facing until he was already an adult. I wish I had relied more on connection and trust to guide my children's choices, instead of leaning so often on fear. The 16th lesson was that my words became their inner voice. I did not fully understand, while my children were young, that the way I spoke to them would eventually become the way they spoke to themselves. Every time I criticized harshly instead of correcting gently, every time I said something in frustration that I did not truly mean, those words did not simply disappear. They became embedded in how my children evaluated their own worth as adults, echoing long after the moment had passed. I have watched my grown children repeat, almost word for word, both the encouragement and the criticism I gave them decades ago, in the way they speak to themselves, and even in the way they now speak to their own children. This lesson alone changed how carefully I chose my words for the rest of my life, because I finally understood how long those words would live. The 17th lesson I learned too late was that apologizing to my children did not weaken my authority, it strengthened our bond. For a long time, I believed that admitting fault to my own children would somehow diminish their respect for me. So I avoided apologies, even when I clearly owed one. But children are remarkably perceptive. They know when they have been wronged, whether we admit it or not, and silence in the face of a clear wrong teaches its own quiet, damaging lesson. When I finally began offering sincere apologies for my mistakes, rather than defending or minimizing them, my children did not respect me less. They respected me more, because I had shown them what real accountability looks like, something no lecture of mine had ever managed to teach them nearly as well. The 18th lesson was that I could not control the outcome, only the environment. I spent years believing that if I simply did everything correctly, said the right things, made the right choices, my children would turn out exactly as I hoped. But children are their own people with their own free will, their own struggles, and their own paths to walk, some of which will not align with what we imagine for them, no matter how carefully we planned. There were choices my children made, as young adults, that I would never have chosen for them, and moments where I had to sit quietly with my own disappointment rather than impose it on them. Eventually, I understood that my role was never to control the outcome. My role was to create a safe, loving, honest environment, and then trust my children to find their own way, even when that way looked different from the one I had pictured. The 19th lesson I learned too late was that quality time could not fully replace quantity of time. For years, I told myself that a few meaningful moments were enough to make up for being consistently busy or distracted. I believed intensity could substitute for presence. But children do not experience love in efficient, scheduled bursts. They experience love in the ordinary, boring, repeated moments, the quiet car rides, the mundane dinners, the slow afternoons with nothing special happening at all. I remember planning one elaborate vacation each year, convinced it would outweigh months of distracted evenings, only to learn later that my children barely remembered the vacations at all, but remembered vividly the small, unplanned moments in between. It was in these unremarkable hours, not the occasional grand gesture, that my children actually felt most secure and most loved. The 20th lesson was that my children's emotions were not inconveniences to manage, but signals to understand. When my children cried, argued, or expressed anger, my first instinct was often to stop the behavior as quickly as possible, rather than understand what was underneath it. I treated their big emotions as problems to solve rather than messages to receive. A slammed door, a burst of tears, a sudden silence. I saw these only as disruptions to correct rather than doors into what they were truly feeling. Later I learned that every outburst, every tear, every moment of frustration was communication, often about something deeper than the surface issue. When I began asking, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" instead of simply trying to make the feeling stop, I understood my children far more deeply, and they, in turn, felt far more understood. The 21st lesson I learned too late was that my children would remember how I made them feel long after they forgot what I said. I used to believe the specific advice, lectures, and lessons I gave my children were what would stay with them. But as they grew into adults, I realized they rarely remembered the exact words of my guidance. What they remembered was the feeling. Did they feel safe with me? Did they feel judged? Did they feel like they had to earn my love? Or did they feel it was simply given, without conditions attached? I have asked my grown children, more than once, what they remember most from their childhood, and almost never do they recall a specific lecture or piece of advice. They recall a feeling, a warmth, or sometimes, painfully, a coldness they still remember precisely. The emotional residue of our relationship outlived every individual conversation we ever had. The 22nd lesson was that letting go did not mean loving less. It meant loving differently. As my children became adults, I struggled deeply with the shift from being needed constantly to being needed occasionally. I mistook their growing independence for a loss of closeness, and for a while, I resisted it, holding on tighter instead of adjusting. I called too often, offered advice that was no longer asked for, and could not understand why my closeness now felt like pressure rather than comfort to them. But independence was never a rejection of our bond. It was the natural, healthy outcome of raising a child well. Learning to release control while still offering love, without strings and without guilt, was one of the most difficult and most necessary transformations of my entire life as a parent, and one I am still, even now, learning to practice. The 23rd lesson I learned too late was that I needed to build a life beyond my children before they left. For so many years, my identity was almost entirely wrapped around being a parent. It gave me purpose, structure, and meaning. But when my children grew and began building their own lives, I felt a kind of quiet loss I did not expect, an emptiness where my sense of self used to be. I did not know who I was in a house that no longer needed me the way it once had, and the silence felt unbearable at first. I wish I had nurtured my own passions, friendships, and identity alongside my parenting, rather than after it. A parent who has their own full life does not love their children less. They simply have less pressure on their children to fill a space that was never truly theirs to fill, and their children, in turn, feel freer to build lives of their own. The 24th lesson was that forgiveness, both giving it and asking for it, needed to happen while there was still time. There were disagreements, hurtful words, and misunderstandings across the years, some of which lingered far longer than they should have. Pride often kept me from being the first to reach out, to apologize, or to forgive. I let small wounds calcify into years of quiet distance, telling myself there would always be time to mend things later, that the right moment would eventually arrive on its own. But time is not something any of us are guaranteed, not with our children, and not with our own parents either. I learned, sometimes painfully, that carrying old wounds into the later years of life only steals the peace that could have been shared instead. Reconciliation, when it is possible, should never be delayed by pride, because pride has never once brought anyone closer to the people they love. And the 25th lesson, the hardest lesson of all, the one that took me almost an entire lifetime to fully understand, is this: raising a child well means raising them to eventually not need you in the same way anymore. Every single lesson I have shared with you today points back to this one truth. From the moment they are born, we are not simply raising children. We are slowly, carefully, preparing them to leave us. Every skill we teach, every boundary we set, every ounce of confidence we help build, is preparation for a day when they will stand on their own, make their own choices, and build their own lives, often far away from the home we built for them. This is not a failure of parenting. My friends, this is the entire point of parenting. And yet nothing prepares your heart for how strange, how quiet, and how bittersweet that success actually feels once it finally arrives. I remember standing in my son's newly empty room, folding a blanket he no longer needed, feeling both immensely proud and quietly heartbroken at exactly the same time. That, I have come to believe, is simply what love looks like at the finish line of parenting. Pride and grief, standing together in the same doorway, neither one cancelling out the other. Before I close today, I want to speak for a moment to a few different kinds of parents watching this, because I know you are not all in the same season of life, and this lesson does not land the same way for everyone. To the young parent watching this with a baby asleep on your chest, exhausted beyond words, wondering if you will ever sleep a full night again, I want you to know that this hard season is not wasted time. It is not something to simply survive until the real parenting begins later. Every late night, every worried phone call to the pediatrician, every clumsy attempt to soothe a crying child, is already the real thing. You do not need to wait for some easier future to begin loving well. You are already doing it, even on the days it does not feel that way. To the parent of teenagers watching this, feeling shut out, feeling as though the child who once ran to greet you now barely looks up from their phone, I want you to know that this distance is not usually rejection. It is development. It is a young person practicing independence in the only way they know how, often clumsily, often without the grace to explain what they're feeling. Stay near. Stay soft. Do not mistake their silence for the end of your closeness. It is often only a pause, not a conclusion. To the parent whose children have already left home, who is sitting in a quiet house right now, feeling a little bit like I once did, I want you to know that this ache you feel is not a sign that you failed. It is often a sign that you succeeded. A quiet house is frequently the evidence of a job done well, of children confident enough to build a life of their own. Grief and pride can share the same room, my friends, and it does not mean something has gone wrong. And to the parent who is estranged, whose relationship with their child has grown distant or painful for reasons too complicated to fit into a single video, I do not want to offer you an easy answer, because there rarely is one. I only want you to know that the door, on your side at least, can remain open, gently and without pressure, for as long as it takes. Sometimes healing comes on a timeline none of us would have chosen, and sometimes it does not come at all in the way we hoped. Either way, you are not alone in that particular grief, even when it feels like the loneliest one there is. My friends, if there is one thing I want you to carry away from everything I have shared today, it is this: the years with your children, whether they are still small or already grown, are shorter than they feel while you are living them. I know how endless the sleepless nights can seem. I know how exhausting the arguments, the worries, and the responsibilities of raising another human being can feel. But one day, without any warning at all, the house grows quiet, and you find yourself wishing for just one more ordinary, unremarkable evening with your children still small enough to need you close. If your children are young right now, please hear me when I say this. Hold them, yes, but hold them loosely enough that they can grow. Correct them, yes, but correct them with a voice gentle enough that they will still want to come to you when they are struggling. Provide for them, yes, but remember that your presence will always matter more than anything you can buy. And most of all, love them not for who you hope they will become, but for exactly who they already are, right now, in this very moment, without waiting for some future version of them to finally earn it. And if your children are already grown, and if there are things left unsaid between you, I gently encourage you not to wait. Make the phone call. Say the words you have been holding back. Offer the apology, or offer the forgiveness, whichever one is yours to give. None of us are promised tomorrow, and the relationships we treasure most deserve more courage than our pride usually allows us to give them. Being a parent is one of the most beautiful, most difficult, most humbling roles any of us will ever hold. We will make mistakes. We will misunderstand our children at times, just as they will misunderstand us. But if we can learn to love with open hands instead of tightly closed fists, if we can learn that our job was never to hold on forever, but to prepare them to walk confidently without us, then we will have done the most important work a parent can ever do, and that work will outlive every single one of us. I think, in the end, this is what I most wish someone had told me when my children were small enough to fit in one arm. Not a warning to cherish every moment, because no parent can sustain that kind of constant gratitude in the middle of an exhausting day, and it is unfair to expect it of ourselves. Instead, I wish someone had simply told me that love, real love, the kind that lasts a lifetime, is not measured by how tightly you hold on. It is measured by how well you prepare someone to walk away from you, and how warmly you welcome them back, again and again, for as long as you both shall live. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, my friends. I hope something in this video reached your heart, whether you are raising little ones right now, watching your children build lives of their own, or simply remembering the parents who raised you. If this message meant something to you, I would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it today, because there is likely someone in your life who has been carrying this exact lesson alone, wondering if anyone else understands. Until next time, hold your loved ones a little closer, forgive a little faster, and remember that it is never too late to say the words that matter most. This has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. I will see you again soon.